All right, welcome back to Biomechanics Lab. This is going to be our lecture 1 video over Chapter 3. This is going to concern basic biomechanical factors and concepts. And my name is Kevin Tokoph. All right, the first thing we're going to discuss are scalars versus vectors. So I don't believe in this degree plan physics is a required course. Some of you may have had physics, others may have not. So first let's define a scalar quantity and a vector quantity. A scalar quantity is a quantity that has a magnitude, but it does not have a direction. So what that means is a magnitude is just a number. So for example, if something has a mass of 100 kilograms, the 100 would be its magnitude, okay? However, mass does not have a direction. Mass, there is no direction specified by mass. And so for that reason, mass would be an example of a scalar quantity. Now, if we looked at a vector quantity has both a magnitude and a direction. So for example, if we're talking about a force, okay, so if you are doing boxing and you punch somebody right in the face, that force has some number that goes with it. It's measured in newtons. That's the unit. So I don't know how many newtons it was. Maybe it was 300 newtons. But it had a direction. It was in the direction of your opponent. Okay. So for that reason, force would be an example of a vector. Okay. So scalars do not have a direction. And other examples that are important are distance, and we mentioned mass, and speed. Okay. We'll talk a little bit more about those in just a minute. Vector quantities, some of the important ones are going to be displacement, force, velocity, acceleration, impulse, and momentum, okay? And one thing I will specify is you might say, well, distance, isn't that the same thing as displacement? And no, those are not. And actually, we're going to slip over to a paintbrush, and I'm going to explain that using the racetrack example. All right, so I have a racetrack right here, and we're going to use this to illustrate some of the basic concepts of scalars versus vectors. So we got these race cars, and I'm going to assume they're moving in this direction. But let's basically track the path of any of the cars. Okay, so what's going to happen is, I'm going to start here, and you're just going to go along the racetrack. This is really hard with this mouse. You're going to go around this racetrack like this, whatever, you get the idea. And whoops, and then they're going to come right back to where they started, okay? Now, if somebody asks you what distance did they travel, well, they have tools that you can do that. I mean, I've actually seen people at UT Tyler, they go along the fields, they've done it on the track, and, up at in the gym, in the HPC, and they just have this little thing that kind of looks like I don't know what it is. It's bad. It's like a little bitty lawnmower, but it just has one wheel on it, and you just wheel it over the distance that you're going, and it tracks the distance, okay? So you would just take that machine, I don't know what it's called, but I think you get the idea, and you just go along the track and get right back to the point, and it would read some number, I don't know, maybe it was half a mile, okay? 1/2 of a mile, okay? That's your distance, okay? Distance is a scalar, right? Distance cares about the path, okay? Meaning, if you go this way, it's a different path and different distance than if you go like this, just a simple track like that. So if you went like this, that's a different path, okay? This is obviously a much shorter distance. However, either way, if I go along this red line and get back to the same position, or if I do the green one, again, I get back to the same position, that's a displacement of 0, okay? That's a displacement of 0, meaning displacement does not care about the path. It's path independent. For displacement, you only care about the initial and final positions. So for example, let's say that you had this car and it started the race but then had like a little wipeout and it kind of just ended up right there, okay? Well, you could use that same tool I just mentioned, I don't know what it's called, and you could measure how far this car actually went before it came to a stop. The distance, you just travel along this red line, right? You get the idea, and it would read some number. However, remember, distance is path dependent. Displacement is path independent. So displacement is just a measure of the linear distance between the initial and final position. So how would I measure the displacement? Just draw a straight line from the initial to the final position. And you would basically measure the length of this line, and that's your displacement. Obviously, you can see the distance is a very different idea than the displacement. A displacement is only the measure of the distance from the initial to final position if you go in a straight line. So that's why if you do this racetrack and end up at the same position you started at, your displacement is 0. It doesn't matter if you do 1,000,000 laps. If you get back to the same initial position, your displacement is 0. Now your distance is going to be massive, okay? But your displacement is 0. Displacement is only the linear distance from initial to final position. All right, so let's talk about displacement, velocity, and acceleration. These are normally the more important quantities when we're looking at biomechanics or physics, okay? So first of all, displacement, and I mentioned this in the paintbrush part. Displacement, which is given by delta x normally. Delta is this triangle symbol. It means a change in x or a change in position. Displacement is the linear difference between the initial and final positions. Okay, so if we looked back at that racetrack example, whenever you do one complete lap, your initial position is your final position, right? You get back to the same position. So there's no difference in the initial and final positions, so the displacement actually on a racetrack is 0. It doesn't matter if you do 100 laps on the racetrack. You still get back to the same position, so your displacement is 0. Now your distance is some really huge number, because distance, you count every little change that you did over the course of the entire race, okay? But displacement is only the linear distance between the initial and final positions, okay? Velocity, given by v normally, is the change in position with respect to time, which we normally say is delta x divided by delta t. Delta t is the time interval. Or we can say the displacement divided by the time interval. Now, one thing that's important to understand is when we look back at the racetrack example, if we start at the starting point of the race and get right back to it, which is what a race implies, we said our displacement is 0, which indicates our velocity is actually 0, believe it or not. Because if we plug in 0 in for the displacement here, 0 divided by any time interval is still 0, okay? Now, very similar to the way that distance was not 0, the speed is not 0. Speed is a scalar quantity, okay? So if you took the distance divided by the time interval, then that would be some non-zero number for the speed, okay? Now acceleration, given by a, is the change in velocity with respect to time. Usually we denote that as delta v divided by delta t, or the change in velocity divided by the time interval, okay? If you do not change velocities, meaning your velocity is constant, then the acceleration is 0, because if my velocity is constant, delta v is 0, and then divided by any time interval, the acceleration will be 0. So acceleration implies that your velocity is changing. So for example, in your car, if you're going in a straight line, this is the simplest example, down the interstate, you put on the gas, and your velocity increases from 40 miles an hour to 70 miles per hour, that would imply an acceleration because your velocity is changing. However, if you get up to the 70 miles per hour and you go 70 miles per hour for a good 5 minutes, even though your time interval is 5 minutes, your velocity didn't change, so over that interval, your acceleration would be 0, okay? Now, some other things that have to do with more with Newton's laws. Force, torque, momentum, and impulse, okay? Force is basically anything that causes an object to accelerate. So whenever you have a net force on any object, it will accelerate. Okay, so a great example of this is if you have a box on a table and you start pushing the box, you're applying a force on the box, and what happens? The box starts to move, right? So a force is anything that causes an object to accelerate. One thing that's important, and we'll go over this in 1 minute, force is linear. So force only causes something to move in a straight line, okay? And it's quantified by Newton's second law. Force equals the mass of the object times its acceleration. So force will cause an object to accelerate. Okay. By the way, for the quiz, you should also be familiar with potentially Newton's first law, his second law, and third law. Just very basically what they are. You can find the other ones in your textbook for the course. Now, the reason I mentioned that force causes something to move in a straight line is because we have another thing called torque. Torque is the component of a force that produces a rotation about an axis. As you'll find in lecture for biomechanics, torque is probably by far the more important quantity. If you think about something moving about an axis, a great example of this is if you look at a clock, you have the minute hand or the second hand that moves around the clock from 1 to 2 to 3, back up to 12, and then back to 1, right? And that hand is moving around a central axis. And there has to be some force causing it to rotate, and the component of the force that causes that rotation about the axis is called the torque. Now, by the way, you don't really need to know any of these formulas right now, okay? But I will say this for lecture because you will see it. Torque is given by the force times the length of the length between the rotation and the point of application of the force, and then it's multiplied by the cosine of the angle that causes perpendicular relationship. Okay, you don't need to worry about this right now. Just understand that torque is the component of a force that produces rotation about an axis. Okay. Momentum has a little bit more to do with Newton's first law, which basically says that an object that's in motion will remain in motion unless it's acted on by an external force. So there's a tendency of objects to remain in motion. Okay? Momentum sort of quantifies that. Momentum is a measure of an object's resistance to changing velocity. Okay? So if you have more mass, and this is kind of what the law of inertia, Newton's first law, implies. If you have more mass, you have more of a tendency to remain in that state of motion. So momentum, which is unusually given by p, that's the symbol for momentum, it's equal to the mass of the object times its velocity. So you have more momentum when you have more velocity. You also have more momentum when you have more mass. Okay? So for example, a 200-pound person moving at 5 meters per second has more momentum than a 100-pound person moving at 2 meters per second. The first person has more mass and more velocity. So you can increase your momentum by having more mass and more velocity. And the more momentum you have, the more force it's going to require to bring that object to a stop or to change its velocity in any way. Okay? Impulse is the change in momentum over time. There's a formula that you're going to see in your physics course, the lecture, or biomechanics I should say, called the impulse momentum theorem. Impulse is given by J, okay? And impulse is basically equal to two things. The impulse J is equal to the force times the time that two objects are in contact. So for example, a typical example of impulse is when a batter in baseball uses the bat and hits the ball. Well, the ball is hit with the bat with some force F. The ball is actually in contact with the baseball bat for some period of time. It's a very short period of time, but it is in contact with the baseball. The product of the force of the bat hitting the ball and the time that the ball's in contact with the bat, that's the impulse. It turns out that that impulse is equal to the change in momentum. Because remember, the baseball has some mass, right? And it's initially heading towards the batter with some velocity, and then it leaves the batter in the opposite direction going with another velocity. Well, it turns out that if you take the force times the time, or the impulse, that's equal to the mass times the change in velocity of the baseball. Okay, this is referred to as the impulse momentum theorem. Okay, and we say basically that impulse is the physical quantity that changes the momentum or changes the velocity of an object. Okay? So these are some of our basic biomechanical and physical principles. Now, let's talk about levers. Because the vast majority of things we'll talk about in biomechanics, they don't just use simple force, they use torque. And I'm going to hint this a lot, and I guarantee you it'll appear on your quiz. Torque is the component of a force that causes rotation around an axis. That's how joints work, okay? There's an axis, that's the actual joint. There's a resistance, or the weight that that muscle has to move, and then there's the force that is produced by the muscle itself, okay? And there are three classes of levers. There's first class, second class, and third class. I'm going to preface an important point here. Most of the joints in the human body are third class levers. The majority of them are third class. However, some of them are first and second class, so let's discuss that. A first class lever is something that basically works like a seesaw, meaning the force, and by the way, the force is always going to be defined as F is the force that the muscle produces. The resistance is usually the bones and anything associated with the bones. And if you're holding a weight in your hand or something, that also classifies as the resistance. It's what the muscle basically has to lift. For first class levers, the force and the resistance are on opposite sides of the axis. So it's going to work exactly like a seesaw. So the example here is this muscle in your neck, which I'm going to look at it because I don't remember. But it's actually the erector spinae extending the head on the cervical spine. This is a first class lever. So that erector spinae muscle is going to produce a force downwards, which is going to cause the resistance to move up. Okay? This moves downwards, the resistance moves up, just like a seesaw. And so what this is an example of is if you're sitting up right now and you rotate your head back to look up at the ceiling, that's what this motion is. That's an example of a first class lever. And the key with understanding these levers is the relative positions of the force, the axis, and the resistance. Okay? For first class levers, the force and resistance are on opposite sides of the axis of rotation. First class is just like a seesaw. For second class levers, it's a little bit different, okay? The resistance is actually between the axis and the force produced by the muscle. And an example of this is going to be the gastrocnemius in the calf. So the gastrocnemius is going to provide a force upwards when you shorten it in a concentric contraction. Okay, this is like a calf raise that you would do in the gym, or when you stand on your tippy toes to look up at something, okay? This gastrocnemius is going to provide a force up, but the resistance is actually pretty much these bones in your feet and then your leg. Okay, and actually if you're standing upright, it's pretty much most of your body. Okay, the gastrocnemius is a pretty strong muscle. Okay, so the gastrocnemius is going to provide a force up that's going to move all these resistance bones and all the flesh and everything else up, but the axis is pretty much where your toes are. Okay, think about doing a calf raise in the gym or just standing on the tip of your toes. The axis where you're rotating about is pretty much right here. Okay, your tippy toes are planted on the floor. The force is at the back of your leg and your gastrocnemius, and then the resistance is everything in between the axis and the muscle. This is an example of a second class lever. Again, notice the relative positions of these with respect to the first class. They're different. And it's no exception for third class levers. The arrangement is also different. For third class levers, which have a tendency to be pretty weak, we have the force provided in between the resistance and the axis. Okay? Like I mentioned before, very important point, third class levers constitute most of the joints in the human body. Most of them are third class levers. The prime example of a third class lever, and in fact when I was an undergraduate and I did biomechanics lab, we actually did our study, our project on the bicep. We use electromyography on the bicep. The bicep is a perfect example of this. And in this, the bicep is going to provide a force upwards. It's going to cause flexion of the elbow, so like doing a bicep curl. But the axis is the axis of the elbow joint itself is on one side of the force, but the resistance is everything on the other side. That includes the radius and the ulna, most of it, the hand, any weight you're holding in your hand. Okay? And the force, like I said, between those two. Third class levers tend to be fairly weak. Okay? Now, what I'm going to say is that first class levers, great examples are the erector spinae, like I mentioned. Also the triceps brachii, an extension of the elbow. Those are also an example of a first class lever. Okay? Second class, like we mentioned, the gastrocnemius and the soleus in plantar flexing and calf extension. The third class levers, excuse me, bicep brachii, brachialis, those are muscles that pretty much do similar things in flexion of the arm, or the elbow I should say. But there's one thing I want to mention here. We have a concept called mechanical advantage, okay? A mechanical advantage is basically what do you get, in other words, how much can you lift considering how much force you put in. So the way to think about it is like this, okay? Imagine studying for an exam. Let's say that you studied your butt off for this one exam. It's a really hard class. You study your butt off. You studied probably a total of 60 hours. Like you studied an unrealistic amount, but you failed the test. You feel pretty bad about that, right? That would be sort of like a mechanical advantage less than 1, okay? Mechanical advantages are either less than 1, equal to 1, or greater than 1. So mechanical advantage is how much do you get out considering what you put in? Well, for first class levers, they can either be equal to 1, less than 1, or greater than 1. Those are pretty variable. However, for second class levers, the mechanical advantage is always greater than 1. That's an example of where you study like the night before an exam and you make a 100. You didn't really put much in, but you got a lot out. Whenever you don't have to put much force in to lift a huge amount, that indicates you have a mechanical advantage greater than 1. So like I said, it's like where you study the night before an exam, you barely studied, and you get a really good grade. You didn't have to put much effort in, and you got a lot out of it, okay? In other words, you got a good grade. The gastrocnemius, that would be an example of something that has a mechanical advantage greater than 1, meaning that because of the nature of how this muscle is set up relative to the axis of rotation and the resistance, you could actually, the amount you can lift is actually more weight than the force that's produced by the gastrocnemius. You don't have to put in as much effort for the gastrocnemius to lift a huge amount. That's why you can pretty much stand up and do a calf raise and lift your whole body pretty much off of the ground because the gastrocnemius has a mechanical advantage greater than 1. You put in less than you get out. Third class levers are like the example where you study all night and you study 60 hours for the exam, ridiculous amount, and you still fail the test. These have a mechanical advantage less than 1. You put in a lot and you don't get much out. Okay, a lot of people will tell you the biceps are some of the weakest muscles in the body, okay? Relative to the amount they can lift, that's pretty true. The biceps have to provide an enormous amount of force to lift a very little amount of weight. In fact, with the major muscle groups, even if you include the triceps, you count all the legs, the abs, the shoulders, the biceps are generally the weakest muscle group. That's because they are third-class levers. Okay? In fact, for the bicep, the force is applied so close to the axis of rotation, I believe it's something like the bicep has to provide a force about 10 times greater than the force that you're actually trying to lift. Okay, so in other words, if you were trying to lift something with a weight of 10 newtons, you'd actually have to have a force of about 100 newtons to lift it. So the biceps really are very inefficient muscles. Okay, they're very inefficient, is what we could say. And one thing generally for third-class levers, and I'll just talk about these because most of the muscles are third-class, the closer the force is to the axis of rotation, the less efficient the muscle is. So for example, if the bicep attached halfway across the arm, so if it attached like right here, to where the force was much farther away from the axis of rotation, i.e. the elbow, it would turn out that this muscle could actually lift a lot more. But because the muscle attaches so close to the axis, it's a very inefficient muscle. Okay? So remember that. First class are variable. I'm not going to ask anything about that. But second class levers have a mechanical advantage greater than 1. Third class levers have a mechanical advantage less than 1. Okay? And that means that second class levers are more efficient. You don't have to put much in to get a lot out. Third-class levers are not efficient. You have to put a lot in to get not much out. What I am going to show you is this slide right here, okay? This is kind of cool. And I'll tell you this, the bicep is most similar to this picture B right here, okay? It's most similar. All three of these are third class levers. I'm not doing the slides on first and second class. But notice something. Notice in this case when the resistance arm, the distance between the force and the resistance, is about equal to the distance between the force and the axis. They're both 10. This is 10, whatever units that is. This is 10. Okay, probably centimeters or something. Okay, and you'll notice that if I have a resistance of 10, I have to provide a force double that, 20. So if this resistance was 10 newtons, I'd have to provide a force of 20 newtons. Double that just to lift it. Okay? You notice the mechanical advantage is less than 1. If we move the force, so in other words, the attachment of the muscle, much closer to the axis of rotation, like we have in the bicep, in the elbow, what you'll notice is that if I have the resistance the same, the resistance is still 10 newtons, I have to provide even more force, 40 newtons. Okay, and what you'll find is as you push this force closer and closer to the axis, where it's probably around here for the bicep, it's going to end up being about 80 to 100 newtons of force just are required to lift that same 10 newtons of resistance. Okay, so the key here is if you take that force or the attachment point of the muscle and move it closer and closer to the axis of rotation for third class levers, you have to provide more and more force from the muscle just to lift the same resistance. Okay, here's another thing. If I move the force in the opposite direction, so if I move it now towards the resistance away from the axis, what happens? Same resistance, I have to provide only 13 1/3 newtons of force, so less force than was required here. So hopefully that makes sense, and what you see here is the biceps, as you, for the biceps, as you move the force closer and closer to the axis of rotation, what happens to the mechanical advantage? It drops. But if I move the force closer and closer to the resistance, which is definitely not how it is in your arm, the mechanical advantage increases. But for third class levers, it'll always be less than 1. Okay? And this is just one slide showing the difference between mechanical advantages. So here's a mechanical advantage of 1. I have to provide something with a mass of 50 kilograms to hold something that's 50 kilograms. Okay, that's a mechanical advantage equal to 1. However, if I only have to provide a mass of 25 kilograms to hold something that's 50, I'm not having to put as much in to get as much out. So I have a mechanical advantage greater than 1. In this case, it's 2. So hopefully that makes a little bit of sense. The last thing I'm going to talk about, which is a really important concept, is stability and how it relates to base of support. So what is stability? Stability is the capacity of any system to remain in equilibrium. And that means static or dynamic equilibrium. Okay, so what is static or dynamic equilibrium? First of all, equilibrium is any time you have no change in velocity. So your change in velocity is 0. Now that could mean you're either not moving. If you look at these offensive linemen on the Patriots, they're currently not moving. This is prior to the snap. They're not moving, and so they're actually in static equilibrium. So they're not moving at all. Okay? Their velocity is 0. Their change in velocity is also 0. However, we also have what's called dynamic equilibrium. Dynamic equilibrium is still where your change in velocity is 0, but you can have a non-zero velocity. For example, if you're driving in your car on the interstate at a constant velocity of 70 miles per hour, you're in dynamic equilibrium. You're moving, but you're not changing your velocity. You're staying at 70 miles per hour with no change in velocity. Because you're not changing velocity, you're still in equilibrium, you're just at dynamic equilibrium. So in physics terms, equilibrium means there's no increases, or I could say decreases in velocity, and there's no acceleration. The point is no acceleration. Now, offensive linemen in gridiron football is a great example of the application of stability and base of support. So you'll notice that if you ever watch a football game, all the offensive linemen prior to the snap are sort of in a position like this, okay? You'll notice that they have their feet wider apart. They're certainly not stood up straight, okay? And they're slouched over, basically, okay? Sort of in a squat-like position. Why do they do that? Well, can you imagine what would happen if they were just standing up straight? Well, it'd probably be a lot easier for the defensive linemen to knock them over. Okay, so why do they do this? Well, it turns out stability, or your ability to remain in equilibrium, is increased by widening the base of support. They've got their feet farther apart. In fact, when you do a squat, you usually, unless you're specifically training something, normally the way to lift a lot of weight on a squat is you have a wider base of support. You don't have your feet together. Okay, in fact, that's a good way to injure yourself. So you widen your base of support. You have your feet farther apart, your legs farther apart. You lower your center of gravity. It turns out that when your center of gravity is lower, you have more stability. These linemen are not standing straight up. They're in a squat-like position. They've lowered their own center of gravity. You can also place your center of gravity in the center of the base of support. So we would assume that we can't see it right here, but the center of the base of support is between their feet somewhere. It's not on the left side of their, it's not by their left foot, it's not on their right foot, it's in the middle, okay? If you place your center of gravity in the middle of your base of support, that increases your stability. So what that basically means is you don't want to be leaning towards your left. If you're leaning really towards your left, what's going to happen? If someone bumps into you, like a defensive lineman, you're going to fall over. In fact, if you're leaning too far to your left, it might not even take anyone bumping into you for you to fall over, okay? That's what happens when you're drunk. If you drink too much, you lose your own senses of equilibrium, talk about that in A and P, and you lose your balance because, for the most part, you're swaying from side to side, and it doesn't take much force to knock you over, okay? The other thing that's more obvious about increasing your stability is you just increase your mass. Okay, obviously these offensive linemen are a lot larger than the other players on the field. If you look at, say, the wide receivers or cornerbacks, they're usually between about 180 pounds and about 210 pounds. Offensive linemen usually run from about 290 up to about 330 pounds, and so their mass is a lot larger, so they're much more suited to having more stability and protecting the quarterback who's behind the lineman. Okay, if we go back to some of these definitions like momentum, we see that it's a lot, I mentioned it's a lot harder to change somebody's velocity when they have more mass. Even though the linemen are not moving, and they'll move a little bit once the snap occurs, but even though their velocity is not really that much, the fact that they have more mass is going to make it harder for the defensive linemen and linebackers to change their momentum. They've got more mass. It's a lot easier to change a wide receiver's momentum if you knock into them because they're much smaller. Now, on the same token, a wide receiver is much more suited to changing their velocity when it comes to going out for a pass. If you've seen clips of like Jerry Rice, who's an older player on the 49ers, who was probably the greatest wide receiver in history, they can change direction and speed on a dime to avoid the cornerbacks. They have less mass, and so they're able to do that much easier. A lineman going out for a pass is not going to be able to change their speed or direction very easily because they're more they have more massive. They have more mass. They won't be able to change their momentum as easily. So the importance of this PowerPoint and this presentation is to understand that many of the physics concepts that you would learn about in the physics course are directly applicable to biomechanics and things such as sports, and even things when it comes to just training in the gym and things like rehabilitation. So thank you for watching this. Make sure to prepare for the quiz when you come to class next week. See you next week. Thank you for watching.